Something's happening. There's something in the air. The world is spinning. A heartbeat faster. Tomorrow's calling. Can't you hear it? To people everywhere, reaching out to you and me. The future's ours to share.
Welcome to On-Site Report. I'm Theo Abbott.
And I'm Phoebe Turner.
On-Site Report is a podcast about places and people.
Specifically, this is a series about the city of Vancouver and its transition from a so-called small town into a global metropolis.
Yeah, and both of us kind of grew up on the east side of Vancouver, and during a time when this area was experiencing a lot of gentrification.
Obviously, this is a phenomenon that's pretty troubling to us and to so many of our peers. It's been very painful to witness our community go through such a palpable shift in such a short time. As a result, I think who we are as people is really a product of growing up in this decisive time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that I've really come to realize is that gentrification is only one symptom of larger failures in the organization of how cities are organized and how urban life is organized in general. And, you know, from crises in housing and affordability to an epidemic of poison drugs and rampant gentrification, Vancouver and cities like it have been bifurcated by the configurations of neoliberal globalization.
What do you think for you have been like the most sort of like troubling visual aspects of this, or just like in your personal experience of the gentrification in this city?
I think it's first and foremost, it's been the displacement of people. Mm-hmm. And then it's been the changing of the built environment. Because I think it's important to differentiate between the city as an entity and the people who live in it as an entity, which we often think of as one. Yeah. But people can get up and leave, mm-hmm. or they can be forced out. But the buildings, they get torn down. They don't have a choice to be moved. They don't get like relocated. Yeah. And they get torn down and then replaced with, I mean, in East Van, it's been the ubiquitous, like sleek white condo, mm-hmm. which I think is just a blight on the cityscape.
For sure. Yeah.
What about you?
I mean, it's hard to say. I think you and I obviously both come at this from the perspective of like relatively privileged white people who grew up in the city. So for me, I think like, yes, obviously the displacement of people is really like disturbing to see, but it hasn't necessarily happened to me specifically, which is, as I said, like a hugely privileged thing. But for me, a big part of it, as you said, is just like the physical transformation of the city, and watching the kind of like character that gave it such a like sense of grounding and a sense of place has really changed a lot with those kind of white condos that you're talking about, and the like townhouses that have replaced so much of the individual like family homes. Just the face of the city has changed so much.
Right. I think you're totally right. And this is something that we're going to talk about maybe, I think, in another episode. But for me, one of the things that's really hit home is the branding and exploitation of aspects of the community that are thought of as like cool or authentic being drawn into a market process. Basically being sold as a product on the market in Vancouver, because those are aspects of things that I see as integral to my identity, and then they've become marketed to people as aesthetic lifestyle, like features of an aesthetic lifestyle, and that's like a personal affront, because I always use the example of Macklemore's Thrift Shop that came out in 2012.
A perfect song.
Yeah, a perfect song.
Is what you were going to say, right?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. Because that song came out in 2012, and that was at a time, like after that song came out, it was number one, like a smash hit. Mm-hmm. and thrift shopping became an exercise in aesthetic lifestyle. And before that, for me, thrift shops were where you went when you needed clothing.
Yeah.
Like it was where you went when you
Where
needed
you could
to
afford
swap,
to buy clothes.
yeah, swap your pair of shoes out for another pair of shoes
Yeah.
without paying. And then it became this like emblem or this sort of feather in the hat of what it meant to be like a progressive or hip urbanite.
Totally.
And I remember that it was 2012. I was in grade 9, and I was so confused and sort of angry about that because that's also marks the point when thrift shopping became more expensive. And that affected me directly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Word. This transition from a small town to a global city has left Vancouver very divided, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not just the, this civic bifurcation, if you will, is very much imprinted on the city's built environment. And so our intent with this podcast is to tell the story of Vancouver through an examination of different sites.
But it's not just sites and locations we're going to be looking at. We also really want to take a hard look at some of the important cultural events in Vancouver's history. More recently, the big one that comes to mind, I think, is the 2010 Winter Olympics. But first, we actually want to go a little bit farther back, before Theo and I were even born, to the 1986 World Exposition on Transportation and Communication, which is a bit of a mouthful. So we're just going to call it Expo 86.
We have the greatest pleasure in declaring Expo 86 officially open.
Expo 86, which is what everyone knows it as.
Yeah, I had never heard the full name until we started researching for this. When it comes to understanding Vancouver's recent arrival on the global stage, Expo is I think really the essential place to start. It spanned from May 2nd to October 13th of 1986, and it was Canada's second World's Fair, and Vancouver's really kind of self-declared debut on the world stage.
Right. Yeah. And before we dive a little bit more into Expo, I think it's helpful, or would be helpful, to get a sense of what the city was like before this overhaul began. But like you said, seeing as no one in this room was actually alive during that time, we decided to go out and talk to some people who were. What was Vancouver like in the years leading up to Expo 86?
It was a smaller town feel, but it had a sleazier element to it back then too, because the whole sex industry was on the streets back then. It was so the places downtown like Seymour and the strip along Seymour and Davie had hookers just one after another, block after block. And on Georgia, I remember on Georgia in front of the Vancouver Hotel for a time back in the late 70s, early 80s.
I can't clearly say what it was like before and after, but certainly that expo, I boycotted it. I never went to it because it was very much marketed as something that was just going to be fun and fabulous and like almost a peacemaking thing, because it was bringing all these countries together to show their various kinds of wares. And the very first thing that happened, I remember Mayor Harcourt at the time marketing that, was the necessity to unhouse a whole rack of poor people in the area surrounding Expo, which was down by Science World. And then how Expo, so that was the sad and disgraceful beginning of Expo, and the sad and disgraceful end of Expo was the sale of the lands to the north of False Creek. I would say that Expo said it's okay to do anything to make a big profit. So, hey, and have a good time. A time that was good for a certain number of people who could afford the time.
do not start your engine.
I remember as a teenager, Bill Vander Zalm really indoctrinating people with these ideas that Vancouver was this sleepy little backwater village and it wasn't a world-class city, and that in order to transform it into a world-class city, we had to bring the world to Vancouver, and we had to sell Vancouver to the world because we had this beautiful sort of untapped potential, this sort of diamond in the rough. And the idea was to sell it to the world and to turn it into a world-class city. And what's happened, consequently, I think, is that it's the downtown part of the city anyway has become quite soulless and lacking in a sense of place and sort of cultural identity. And I think that that's a terrible shame.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that there was a more small town feel in Vancouver before Expo, and that it had this seedier underbelly, but that also people like Bill Vander Zalm and later Bill Bennett maybe even leaned into this identity as a means of priming the city for a globalization and for this mushrooming with foreign investment and with sort of opening the city up to the world. And in 1984, Bill Vander Zalm referred in a few different interviews as Vancouver being a city with a lot of challenges, and he kept talking about Vancouver as a challenged city, which I think parallels well with what a lot of people said in the early half of the 20th century about urban decay and urban blight, as some people called it, and areas that were seen as unsavory would be labeled as having blight or labeled as having decay, and this would prime them for an overhaul, for a regeneration, to use the Thatcherism, or for any form of gentrification. And I think there definitely was something similar happening in Vancouver leading up to Expo.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds like it was like part of the pitch for Expo was that Vancouver had this like sleepy small town, if slightly seedy vibe, and that Expo would be the thing that would push it away from being that. I also thought it was really interesting that Gail spoke to like a strong sense of responsibility to her community, and I think like a strong sense of community in general, that she felt so disturbed by the displacements that had to occur in order to make Expo happen. I think it's interesting that a couple of the people that we spoke to seemed to have sort of anti-Expo sentiments, because I feel like in retrospect, like a lot of it gets quite glorified. People seem to have pretty rosy memories of the event, and in hindsight, it does sort of feel like this big like multi-month party that occurred and that became like this grand debut for Vancouver on the world stage. But it was interesting for me to hear people who, not just now, but even at the time, had these sort of anti-Expo sentiments for, I think, very valid reasons. And
it's also become like a meme now, like in like the conscious memory of Vancouver and Expo at the time is just, now people pay premium dollar for Expo t-shirts, and it's like people who are like, politically and, socially conscious in their communities would wear an Expo shirt without 100%. Even flinching at the fact that, like, in our generation, no one would ever wear a 2012 Olympics shirt.
Of course not.
Because we all remember what a disaster socially that was for the city.
Yeah, but I just walked by a vintage store on Commercial Drive the other day, and I sent you guys the photo, and that there was that vintage Expo sweatshirt, and it's $110.
It's $110.
$110, and in very poor condition, might I add.
It's
but
ripped.
You know what? It's kind of sick.
Yeah.
And if I didn't feel the way that I feel, maybe I would buy it.
110 Canadian in 2024 versus 1986. That would, like, I don't know what the inflation is. We should calculate that. That's nuts.
It's a lot of money.
There's something to be said about this feeling in the downtown core as well, that it's sort of post-Expo become, and we're going to talk more about this later in the next episode, but becoming this sort of space that feels vapid for people, and that maybe doesn't feel like it has the kind of life that it once did. And I don't want to, like, I don't want to lean too hard into this because I don't want to seem like we're coming off as nostalgic for a version of the city that we never even lived through. But people's recollection of Expo is obviously mixed. It was, the people's recollection of Expo, but also what Vancouver was like before that. And as you heard Dominique say, the downtown, sort of the central city has become a place that's maybe not as warm as it once was. So I guess the pre-Expo era the pre-Expo Vancouver was definitely a different place.
I think it's interesting what you said about the feeling a sense of nostalgia for a city that we never actually really lived in, because my dad grew up here, and so I've grown up hearing these sort of nostalgic stories about what Vancouver used to be like, both that it was a lot grittier, but also that it just felt more like a community and more like a real place where you would want to live. And just, I don't know, listening to Dominique talk about what downtown specifically has become after the time of after we record this podcast today, I have to go downtown because I have to go to the Apple store to exchange these headphones that I hate. And that's virtually the only reason I would ever go to downtown Vancouver, is to perform some sort of menial task like that. And it's something that I dread because it's just so skin crawlingly empty and soulless down there. It feels like one big Apple store. Yeah. But with cigarette butts everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Temple is what I call the Apple store.
Yeah. I'm going to worship.
Mecca.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's pretty telling about the kind of city that Vancouver has become post-Expo, that it's hard to find people who are actually around or lucid during that event. And so, Expo was many things for the city. On the surface, it was a long and very expensive party. But what was its intended purpose?
Well, I think it's really important to note that Expo took place during the height of what we sort of think back on now as the Thatcher and Reagan era of institutional reform and discursive adjustment. So basically, destination Moneytown was the goal.
yeah, absolutely. And this is when cities around the world were embracing, the political and the economic philosophies of neoliberalism. And in large part, Expo really marks Vancouver's attempt to follow suit.
Mm-hmm. In this sense, Expo was at its very core an economic vehicle more than anything, with this goal of directing Vancouver towards, I don't know, just really a place on the global stage. We wanted to be the new and globalized Vancouver, towards Moneytown.
I think the term you're looking for is destination Moneytown.
That is, thank you. I couldn't quite call it to mind there. To that end, Expo was opened on May 2nd, as I said, by two real icons of the era we're talking about. The Prince Charles, now the King, and Princess Diana, God rest her soul, alongside Canada's own Conservative Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney.
If we measure events like this, or measure their success by the number of people who show up, then with 22 million in attendance, which was double what they actually had projected, then it was a smash hit. Expo was a success. But we also tend to quantify the success of events like Expo and the Olympics by their infrastructural legacies. So really, after 1986, Vancouver was left with a few really important upgrades.
I would say that the most significant of these is the SkyTrain, which is like a subway in the sky for our non-Vancouverite listeners. And it still functions as a keystone of Vancouver's public transit system. It's expanded a lot since Expo 86. But was founded in conjunction with the fair. The other big one that I think of is Science World. It was originally the headquarters of Expo, and now it's this science-themed, sort of like an indoor amusement park. There's no rides, but it's lots of interactive science stuff. I'm sure every single kid in Vancouver went on at least one field trip there, and it's really become integral to Vancouver's skyline.
But yeah, you mentioned Science World, and Science World really is an anomaly in Vancouver, or in the world. I mean, it's a science. Originally, we had it listed as a science-based amusement park. We changed that to science-themed. But and like you also said, there's no rides. it's sort of it's a really strange place.
Yeah. Well, it's a ball for one. I don't know
It's
a lot of
shaped
ball-shaped
like a ball.
buildings.
It's like a geoid. It's very like Burning Man, sort of sacred geometry.
It is very
ball.
it's true.
But this is interesting because it's become this icon of Vancouver's of the False Creek area. When you see Science World, you know that you're in the city, and it helps you to mediate and sort of adjust the local resident to where they are. But when it was first built, people criticized it. And they said, oh, this is kind of really ugly. And this is like the brownstone effect, right? With the Brooklyn brownstones, where they built these lovely buildings as we view them now. But when they were first built, people thought that they were disgusting. And they garnered a lot of criticism. But now they're seen as quintessential to what it means to be in New York. You know, you see the brownstones, you know you're in this area, you know you're in Brooklyn or what have you. And that there seems to be like a certain shelf life with what we build in cities, that after a certain amount of time they become part of the city's environment. And there are spaces, I think, that, or you can talk about like the condos, and we will talk more about condos later, and whether they will have that same effect. Like if in 100 years we'll be oogling at the condos and be like, oh, so authentic to Vancouver's, identity as a city. I don't know if that'll be the case, but it's interesting that Science World has now become so quintessentially Vancouver.
Totally. So you're saying, I think that we should take down all of the condos and just replace them with a whole bunch of sacred geometry geodes
with
for single families.
It's only science geoids.
Yeah, science-based homes.
Everyone works for TELUS.
I would say, though, Expo's legacy has had an impact on Vancouver's built environment, for sure. But it goes far beyond just metro systems and waterfront pavilions and big spheres on the skyline.
Totally. And in the late 1980s, a division of land took place that has and continues to totally reshape and change Vancouver's urban makeup.
Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about the neoliberal globalization of cities, I think the prime example of how this process takes place is the selling off of that kind of public land to private corporations.
And in 1988, Concord Pacific Developments, which was essentially a super conglomerate of all of the top Hong Kong billionaires, Hong Kong real estate development billionaires, they won the bid to purchase the former Expo Fairgrounds. And at the time, Concord Pacific's primary shareholders were Li Ka-shing, Cheng Yu-tung, and Li Shao-ki. Now, remember these names because we're going to be talking more about Li Ka-shing and the legacy of Concord Pacific and its impact on Vancouver's built environment more in later episodes. But for now, we're going to focus on an aspect of this land grab that we don't think gets enough attention.
So in 1989, Li Shao-ki, who was at the time the president of his own Hong Kong-based company, Henderson Development, purchased a smaller section of the original 204 acres of fairground that had been acquired by Concord Pacific. And for this smaller parcel, Henderson Development paid a total of $54 million. By 1990, the company had laid out plans for what they were going to call the International Village Retail Complex.
Yeah, and just to clarify, this represents an acquisition kind of within an acquisition. Concord Pacific got this larger parcel, and then Henderson Development got a smaller parcel within that.
Mm-hmm. So the company had put up an initial $500 million, which is close to $850 million today for this project, which was going to constitute the mall, which is what we're going to be talking about most today. But also these 4 residential buildings that were owned by the same development group and intended to house around 2,000 residents that are adjacent to the small International Village. Originally, they envisioned this whole complex being completed within about 24 months with a sort of estimated completion date of 1995.
Right. And IVM, or International Village Mall, as it's come to be known, didn't end up opening until December 1999. And when it did, the mall was filled with a bunch of empty retail spaces. This was in part the result of a failure to secure a big name retail anchor, an unsuccessful attempt at designing this ground floor marketplace that they had planned out, which is sort of in the same vein as, for Vancouverites, you'll know Granville Island or Lonsdale Quay as these bustling markets where you can buy like food and sort of kitsch specialty items. And maybe for American context, this is comparable with Pike Place in Seattle.
Mm-hmm. Which I think actually really would have been a neat idea if
Totally.
they'd been able to pull it off.
Yeah.
It'd be pretty sweet.
Yeah.
So the plan originally was in the works with a Vancouver architecture group called Interville. Terrible name.
Yeah.
And through community outreach and consultation, they had put together this proposal that they brought to Henderson that wound up being rejected because it wasn't really in line with what they were envisioning, which was more of a upscale and quote unquote global marketplace. So this led them to firing Interville and instead deciding to work with a Toronto-based architecture firm called Kierkegaard. Unfortunately, as the opening date for the mall started to approach, the Henderson Group, as Theo mentioned, was unable to secure lease agreements for the ground floor market, so that just kind of fizzled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and part of the issue here was the ambiguous commitment that the mall had received from the Italian luxury brand Benetton.
Be lovely. Be beautiful.
Be different.
Be kind. Be like you.
Be right. Be wrong.
Be anything. Be yourself.
Be in love.
Be humble. Be brave.
Be happy.
Be great. Be Benetton.
Be Benetton.
Be Benetton. Be Benetton.
Which the Henderson Group was relying on to be the anchor of their second floor, and they called this the Fashion Boulevard. This big name brand was used by Henderson Development to try to attract local tenants, and these tenants were sort of skeptical. Right off the bat, people could tell that something was off about the mall. And part of the reason behind this was the design and the architecture of the space.
Mm-hmm. Now you're giggling, Theo, and I think you're kind of laughing for the same reasons that I am, which is that in our research for this podcast, we were not able to confirm whether the mall was actually at any point in talks with Benetton or whether this was just a name that they'd thrown out there in an effort to lure people in.
Yeah, they had now Benetton is an Italian brand, but they had a commitment from a man who owned a Benetton franchise of sorts in Denver.
Colorado.
In Denver, Colorado. But by the mid 90s, while planning was still taking place, the Benetton name had actually been dropped from the space, and it was now going to be Extreme Sports or something along those lines,
which is a pretty big jump.
Outdoor, yeah, because the Denver brand was a sports version of the original Benetton. It was a more sports oriented, being in Colorado, right? But yeah, they definitely use this. They use this big name brand as a way to try and attract people, but it didn't really pan out.
So Kathleen Warfield describes the final design and architecture of this mall as illustrating numerous aspects of transplanted norms and styles from Hong Kong. And this was not by chance. When Henderson Development cut ties with Interville, they specifically said that Interville's designs had not been in line with the global identity that they were envisioning for their new mall. And Kierkegaard, which is the Toronto company we mentioned, was more willing to play ball. The mall developers made a concerted effort to really market the space to affluent Chinese Canadian residents and a cast of very elite tourists. So they paid very little attention to the culturally and economically diverse makeup of the neighborhoods where this mall is situated. And for context, IVM, or International Village, is located right in the heart of what is often referred to as Canada's poorest postal code. So it's at the intersection of the downtown east side, Chinatown, and False Creek North.
Now, if this sounds completely tone deaf, that's because it was. In an interview with the Vancouver Sun before the mall opened in 1999, Henderson Group representative Alan Lai went so far as to say, if you didn't build this center here, if you just built residential towers, nobody would buy. Today, maybe the price is low, for condos that is, because people are worried about the area. But once the mall is open, it's going to change. That said, everything about this mall was so off the mark, and the mall's current status is an expression of how the project was destined to fail even before the doors opened for business. As of now, International Village isn't much more than an unattended movie theater and a few kitsch shops. As for the ground floor, the once ambitious vision of a lively market, still designated on signage as the Silk Road, has been all but forgotten except for 3 copper emblems imprinted on the vinyl floor. Which, what exactly are they, Phoebe?
They're just so bizarre, and we only figured out the context of this very recently. But there's like built into the linoleum flooring, there's these little copper emblems. One of them's like a chicken, one of them is a pineapple, one of them's a lobster, which if you don't have the context of knowing that this was supposed to be a Silk Road style marketplace, presumably offering that kind of fare, just seems like completely random and quite bizarre design choices.
There's a pineapple and a lobster emblem next to a cell phone kiosk, and it's the new. It was supposed to be the global milk and eggs. It was chicken, totally. Pineapple, lobster. But
I mean, to be fair, when I think lobster, I think prepaid cell phone.
Totally, yeah. And the ground floor now is mostly made up of kiosks and cell phone repair shops.
One fun thing, if you wanted to know, is that all of the cell phone places are owned by the same guy.
However, there are a few gems in the rough.
Oh, for sure. There's like 2 shoe stores in there that are genuinely nice.
Yep.
Definitely deserve a shout out. There's also Rain City Games, really cute little bookstore. There's maybe the most abused and disrespected McDonald's in Canada. That's kind of at like the northwest entrance on Abbott Street.
You want to run up there and get me a fillet of fish?
There's also a store called A Touch of Africa that sells imported goods from all over that continent. And a vaccination clinic, which, you know what? You can't knock that, especially in this day and age. That said, things start to get really dark on the second floor. The last time we visited its hallowed halls, the only operational businesses that we came upon were the Cat Cafe, which was Vancouver's first cat cafe and is very awesome. There was an escape room that we approached, and we weren't even totally sure if it was an escape room because the signage was so unclear. And this woman just kind of appeared from the shadows and was like, "Are you guys here for the escape room?" And we were like, "No, we gotta go."
No one ever comes out of that escape room.
Yeah, never ever.
They're trapped.
And both of these places are located in the would-be fashion boulevard. There's a very depressing half-empty food court. One of the stores there was not open at the time. They had a handwritten sign indicating their very complicated hours of operation. And next to that, there was another sign that said credit card machine stolen.
And
cash only.
And it was $40 coming soon.
Yeah, that's right.
It said coming soon. And then the price was $40, but it was blank.
Yeah, there was no associated image.
It was what is coming soon?
Could be literally anything. Yeah, you'll have to wait until they get their card machine back.
Yeah, and the movie theater is good, and that's the third floor is solely inhabited by the movie theater, once operated by Tinseltown and now owned by the Cineplex conglomerate, which since the opening in 1999. This theater's been the main economic driver of the mall. And that's also why you might hear us refer to this mall as Tinseltown or as International Village Mall, because when it first opened, the theater was, as I said, called Tinseltown. And now, depending on how long you've been in Vancouver, this name's really stuck. This is an interesting point. And I think it's important to note that because something that hasn't been there, the theater that's called Tinseltown hasn't been there for so long, but we still call it that, is I think really indicative of sort of the mall's inability to change and to sort of get with it.
Totally. It's just forever trapped in space and time.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting too. I wonder, the mall is already on its last legs, but people are already talking about the death of cinemas in general. And I wonder how much longer they're going to be hanging on if the entire function of the building is just to house this really not even particularly big. I think there's only 4 or 5 screens up there.
They say 12. They say there's 12 screens, but that could be a lie. It feels smaller. Not only is the mall relatively deserted, the mall's design, as I've mentioned, is seemingly out of place in 2023, and it appears really outdated.
Mm-hmm.
That said, at the time, Alan Lai expressed their confidence that the mall was on the cutting edge of the retail space.
Mm-hmm. He was very enthusiastic about their sort of like brainchild, saying of the design process that, quote, "We looked for one-of-a-kind, unique tenants that you wouldn't be able to find in 99% of shopping malls. We didn't want to build the mall of yesterday. We wanted to build the mall of the future. We wanted to be ahead of everybody," which, I don't know. I'm sure if he was to look at him or look back now, building any mall, let alone the mall of the future at the turn of the century, and thinking that you were on the cutting edge of anything is pretty funny.
Tone deaf.
But he supposedly went about scouting well-known retailers like Benetton, as we mentioned, Versace, and even a store that was just going to be called Expensive.
Expensive, which I think might not have actually existed.
Yeah.
This is another ambiguous aspect of the mall's history,
yeah.
and it's also its relationship with the prospective retailers,
mm-hmm.
because it's really, there's not a lot on the internet, at least, about a mall called Expensive.
Yeah, literally nothing. I mean, it's hard to, if you just look up expensive store.
It sounds like something you would cook up in a board meeting, though.
Yeah.
You're like, we need to attract.
Totally. You're just like throwing names out
there. We need
there
to attract the upper, the elite echelon of consumers. And they're like, a new store called Expensive.
People like expensive things, right?
We'll love that.
So all of these big name retailers were being used in an effort to lure in other prospective tenants, including a local restaurateur by the unlikely name of
Orlando Papa.
Mr. Papa, an individual who, feeling deceived by the Henderson Group's boastful plans, would eventually go on to sue the mall in the early 2000s for lost profits when the restaurant he opened in the so-called Silk Road really failed to make ends meet.
Mm-hmm. The irony of Henderson's vision of the International Village as a mall of the future, beyond just the concept of malls being a part of the future in general, is that the space itself could not be more emblematic of a very specific time and place. Generally, there's just this very static energy inside, despite one of the defining characteristics of the architecture being this vast, like, arching ceiling throughout. Several parts of the mall are really like dingy and dimly lit, which just adds this general ambiance of desolation in the space.
Yeah, and the interior walls are dotted with neon signs, and the Fashion Boulevard has these carved wooden cityscapes intended to sort of conjure visions of Vancouver as a great fashion capital alongside Paris, London, and Milan. And these are mounted above each empty storefront. There seems to be a really pronounced mishmash of interior design styles, and for a mall that was opened a month before the new millennium, the color palette and the overall aesthetic feels very 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
As for the patrons, there's also a lot of people who just seem to be kind of passing through and not exactly shopping, but perhaps using the mall as a pit stop to go to the washroom or to sit down for a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. I think that's mostly, besides going to the movie theater, that's mostly what I've used the mall for. I don't think I'm actually certain I've never bought something at International Village Mall that wasn't a movie theater ticket or maybe a bubble tea.
Yeah.
But we recently took a walk through International Village, and we had a chance to chat with a few of the shoppers there, and even some of the employees who were able to give us a better sense of what it's like to be like a real regular in this space.
Yeah, and why did you come to the mall today?
We went to get the ramen. That's like my favorite ramen ever.
Sweet. Right on.
The bubble tea is also really good.
Cool. And like, why do you guys think it's so empty compared to other malls?
I wonder if it's just the area, maybe. Or like the lack of like stereotypical, like Ardeen's and like all the normal like places you see in a mall. But I kind of like it. It's very. We were just talking about how it's kind of like liminal space here.
A big reason why it's so empty is lots of the space is underutilized.
Well, all of this could be like stores.
But it's also like weird storefronts and weird angles and fitting something like a space like that's going to be.
Yeah.
I also think they need to change the washrooms because the stalls are literally like this low.
The stalls are really low. You can just look down into the stall.
That's just there's a weird uncanny valley that I find in this place that really draws me to it. It's kind of like attractive in that sense. You know?
Coming to a mall that isn't like crazy busy. I like that it's not like a lot of malls like Park Royal and like Metrotown are just like bright like fluorescent white like tiles and everything. It's very unwelcoming.
There's a weird, strange comfort to this place. You know, I've been coming here since like not as much lately in my life, but when I was real young, I would come here with my dad. And get like some crappy food and walk around and shit.
How long have you lived in the area?
Since 15.
Since 2015?
No, since I'm 15 years old.
Since you're 15?
1980 or something.
What do you call this place?
Tinseltown. You got a weird hairdo.
I do. What's your name?
My name is Al. It's not really my name. I've lived in the Fort building since
You lived in the Fort building?
Yeah.
Where is that?
Main and East.
The weirdest part of the mall?
Yeah.
There's so much that's hard to like choose one thing. That's the weirdest part of the mall. Basically, I see like at this point I'm like jaded. I see so many weird things every single day that I just kind of gave up on like caring every time I see something new.
How long have you worked here for?
I've worked here for a year.
It's kind of like a mall with a lot of the sort of corporate veneer stripped away.
So one CBC article recently described the mall as having dueling vibes, which I think is an accurate, if not totally understated gesture to much larger divisions or a bifurcation, if you will, within Vancouver's urban environment.
Totally. This brings up the question of why there's a mall here in the first place. And the answer goes back to this utterly tasteless planning and the approach rolled out by Henderson Development. What the Henderson Group was trying to do in partnership with the city was to was quite overtly to gentrify a working class area by building a shopping center in order to lure people into these condos that they wanted to build. Yeah,
and this area has increasingly become gentrified over the years, but this hasn't been completely the result of the mall. I'd say the mall had very little to do with it, actually. That's because in order to initiate the gentrification of a neighborhood, you need to exploit two main ingredients, which are authenticity and coolness.
I mean, I think it's safe to say that any mall, but especially one that misses the mark as desperately as Tinseltown does, just does not and cannot embody coolness or authenticity on any level.
Right. And the French anthropologist Marc Auger actually coined the term non-place to describe places, such as shopping malls, where human beings remain anonymous and that do not hold enough significance to be regarded as actual places in their anthropological definition. So this is an interesting point because, earlier we heard some people mention liminality and sort of feeling comfortable but also uncomfortable in the space. And the truth is that the mall, any mall is a non-place. But I think that somehow Tinseltown or International Village Mall kind of defies that definition and has come into having this unique identity through being so weird and so idiosyncratic. And over the years, Tinseltown has sort of become part of the surrounding community. And I think the fact that it's such a weird and aesthetically confused space has garnered some real affection from local residents.
For sure. And I mean, for myself as well. Like, I don't know. I think it's kind of interesting that something that's so like aesthetically and architecturally, maybe not unpleasant, but like hostile, also has this sort of, and maybe a lot of it is just nostalgia and that I've been going there my whole life, but there is something just very like comforting about being in that space, even though it's so odd. And even though there really isn't anything to do there, there's just like something about it that kind of makes you feel held on some level. And maybe this goes back to like the brownstone effect that you were talking about earlier, where it's like, it has been so, like International Village has been so reviled and so unsuccessful in all of these tangible ways that we've listed, virtually from the start. And yet, I know you and I have some level of affection for it. And I think if you were to ask a lot of Vancouverites how they feel about Tinseltown Mall, there's this same kind of like condescending, maybe, but genuine affection and love for it as a space.
Yeah, and like, you know, I was recently, or this was about a year ago, I was at a lecture at SFU's Gold Corp building, which is downtown, and it's a arts center, part of Simon Fraser University,
cool flex,
here in Vancouver, that was bought and paid for by the Gold Corp, which is a gold mining company.
Mm-hmm. That's like one of the most evil names I can think of.
Gold Corp, and they're an evil company.
Yeah,
they're sort of a human rights annihilator, as it was put that night, and an environmental annihilator as well. And we were having the lecture was around the theme of it was around a book, but it was also just around, you know, Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous right to manage their own land, and someone put up their hand and asked a question about, you know, how can we be having this kind of discourse in a space that is, you know, a Gold Corp space that's been responsible for such atrocities against the environment and human rights. And Glenn, he clapped back really quickly. And Glenn Coulthard is an Indigenous Dene scholar up at UBC. And he said, you know, what you need to do is you need to turn spaces like this in on themselves. Like, you need to have radical discourses in them. And I think that Tinseltown represents sort of a turning in on itself of the mall space. It's become ensconced by the surrounding community in a really beautiful and authentic way, and it's lost its veneer, and you know, it's lost this layering that malls have that make them sleek and gives them this texture of being so repugnant. And now that texture has gone, it has a new texture that is, I think, perhaps, you know, much more authentic or just much more appealing to local residents, at least.
Occupy International Village Mall.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so this quirky kind of approval from the community does not, of course, equate in any way, shape, or form to profit for the mall's owners. And in fact, the mall actually was at least temporarily up for sale in 2019.
Very short period in 2019.
Yeah.
It was like for 2 weeks, it was up for sale.
I wonder what happened there.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I think that you know, it's possible that the mall's owners have so much money that they're not really worried about. They're just sort of sitting on it and letting
I mean, it's like the space takes up an entire city block in, like, for all its faults, like that area is becoming more and more desirable. I'm sure it's worth
only going to go up.
Yeah,
it's only going to go up. And so maybe they're losing a bit of money right now in taxes and having all of these derelict empty spaces. But they're just speculating on the appreciation of the Vancouver housing market.
They stand to gain a lot in the long run.
Yeah.
Anyways, given the direction that urban development in Vancouver is taking, it's hard to imagine that such an underutilized space will be allowed to exist for very much longer. And as we're kind of talking about, like, I'm sure a lot of people have their eyes on that plot of land.
Yeah. And you know, International Village Mall really stands as this relic of Vancouver's first attempt at becoming the globalized city that it is today. And Henderson Development, they intended this space to be a playground for wealthy consumers and a certain caste of elite tourists. But it never achieved this desired goal. And whereas other places in Vancouver they've really made that transition from, you know, being the sleepy small town to global city, Tinseltown, or IVM, is an unlikely reminder of the kind of place that Vancouver once was, and before it became this unaffordable metropolis.
Henderson Development set out to make an international village, but one that was reflective of a global turn towards neoliberalism and a real departure from community and a connection to place. But the irony is that, seemingly completely by accident, the mall has ended up being a real representation of a relatively authentic dimension of Vancouver's identity.
In its current form, International Village Mall might not be a village, but it's certainly international. It's a confused mix of aesthetics and designs, of people and lifestyles, and like Vancouver as a city, it feels somewhat disjointed, albeit undeniably multicultural. Where are you from?
I'm from India.
Whereabouts in India?
Gujarat.
Hong Kong.
Yeah.
From Hong Kong?
Yeah.
From Hong. And how long have you been in Vancouver?
20 years.
Where are you from?
Finland.
Thunder Bay, Toronto.
But you've been here since you were 15?
Yeah, I traveled here by plane, I think.
And that's why we chose International Village Mall as a starting point, because it represents a really foundational layer of Vancouver's urban development. It's this product of Expo 86, which was Vancouver's inaugural step into being this global city. And although Expo wasn't a complete failure, and it had many successes, it didn't achieve this really desired goal of thrusting Vancouver onto the global stage. But an event that did was the 2010 Winter Olympics.
The International Olympic Committee has the honor of announcing that the 21st Olympic Winter Games in 2010 are awarded to the city of Vancouver.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of On-Site Report. In the next episode in the series, we're going to be looking more into Vancouver as a divided city and how certain places around this city can help us better understand this recent polarization. And if you're in the Vancouver area, we implore that you take a little field trip to International Village Mall for yourselves before it's gone. Go catch a movie, maybe book a visit with the cats, and soak in some of that bizarre, liminal, comforting atmosphere.
On-Site Report is produced and co-written by Charlie Dara.
You gotta fucking do something here.